You're listening to What's Ray Saying, the podcast. It seems like to me the word urban is synonymous with Black and American culture. Urban culture, the urban scene, urban art, urban blight, urban crime, urban renewal, overpopulation, substandard housing, ghettos, gangs, hip-hop. Blacks live in cities, big cities of the South, bigger cities of the Northeast and the Midwest, the West Coast. I really can't even recall in my lifetime ever meeting another black person that is more than one generation from the South, or who can't draw their family roots from the South in some way.
What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying? What's Ray saying?
From the source of all black knowledge, pushing forward, being strong, living the strenuous life, still learning, still seeking advice, looking for more goals, checking some off the list, bent but not broken, armed, trained, and equipped for battle. You're listening to What's Ray Saying, the podcast. Coming up, an examination of a simply put question for a complex list of reasons. Why do so many blacks live in the city? This episode of What's Ray Saying is brought to you by The Story Bear, providing entertaining and soothing personal stories in the comfort of your home or office. No more page turning or swiping. Growl, baby. Oh, lay your head right down here, sugar. The chicken said, cock-a-doodle-doo, baby. Oh, I'm just happy to see you, honey. It's not even the end yet, baby. The Story Bear. In your home or office. Prior to 1863, nearly 95% of blacks living in America lived in the South, and the remaining population, both slave, free, or whose runaway status was unclear, were spread throughout the Northeast and the Midwestern United States. It was simply uncommon to see a black outside the South prior to the Civil War. Now, many Union soldiers who were predominantly from the North had never seen a black person or the horrors of slavery in their entire lives. When President Abraham Lincoln issued an executive order on January 1st, 1863, known as the Emancipation Proclamation, an order that changed the federal legal status of more than 3 million enslaved black people in all the designated areas of the South, from slave to free, a dramatic increase in blacks escaping occurred. Now, blacks, having heard of this from Union soldiers and in informal communications between plantations, from overheard conversations by masters, overseers, and other concerned white people, many blacks who were not petrified by fear began to escape the control of their owners and the Confederate Army that used slaves as manual labor, began to run away toward advancing Union troops that allowed some of these freed slaves to enlist in the Union Army or serve as cooks, laundry washers, laborers, and even scouts. This provision had the effect of driving blacks out of rural areas and plantations. With limited white supervision, it was easy to escape. In all, this struck a serious blow to the economic and labor structure of the South at the height of the war, and changed the initial and stated purpose of the war from maintaining the Union to maintaining the Union and ending slavery. Following the defeat of the Confederacy, the end of slavery, and the start of Reconstruction in the South, the primary motivation for blacks to leave rural areas and the South as a whole was generally the failure of Reconstruction officials to enforce their rights as citizens, rights being denied them primarily by whites, abusing them, white Southerners who refused to accept blacks in any status above that they had as former slaves. Now, here's a list of some of the nature of some of those abuses. Disenfranchisement, or refusing to allow blacks to vote. Now, when whites regained power in the South in 1877, when the federal government removed all the military troops from the South to oversee Reconstruction, whites primarily came back to power, and they passed laws that made voter registration more restrictive. Essentially, they forced tens of thousands of blacks off the voting rolls. Now, there were exploitations and oppressions. By refusing to allow blacks to leave plantations or the control of former owners, forcing blacks to work as sharecroppers in a perpetual system of debt that forced blacks into uncompensated labor, beatings, whippings, long after slavery had ended constitutionally. Along with this came another hideous practice known as the convict lease system. Given that there were few active prisons in the South following the Civil War and the need for labor by the states, tens of thousands of black men were arrested for crimes like homelessness, loitering, walking at night, being in debt to white people. And all of these supposed crimes were vigorously enforced and strictly sentenced. Now, it wasn't until 1928 that the state of Alabama ended this practice. Still, throughout the South, it persisted until 1942, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an executive order bringing this practice to an end. Or did it? And this practice was just full of torture, abuse, and maltreatment. a system that allowed private contractors to purchase the services of black convicts from the state or local government for the specific purpose of working. Many of these were leased and sent to work in mines, on plantations, or other state projects. Now, to reinforce and maintain white supremacy throughout the South, a very strict system of segregation or black codes or Jim Crow laws were put into place that limited black participation in everyday social life, reinforcing inferiority in treatment in public spaces. Informally, however, to maintain order and reinforce to blacks to stay in their place by example, blacks were routinely beaten. Black women were raped for getting out of line. Lynching was widespread and often included spectators with women and children. At one particular lynching, it was said that nearly 15,000 people were in attendance. Lynchings were so common that they were routinely advertised in newspapers prior to the event in order to give photographers time to arrive early and prepare their camera equipment. Photographers would often sell their pictures and postcards. This is one reason why blacks were starting to leave the South. The pressures of life in Jim Crow South and labor shortages in northern factories brought about by World War I resulted in thousands of jobs opening up for blacks in steel mills, railroads, meat packing plants, and the automobile industry. With a combination of both of these things, blacks were drawn out of the South in a form of chain migration by individuals and families. This pool of jobs in the North was strengthened by the efforts of labor agents sent by Northern businessmen to recruit black workers. In some cases, Northern companies offered special incentives to encourage blacks to relocate, to include free transportation and even low-cost housing in some cases. These combined forces resulted in one of the largest and most rapid mass internal movements in history, perhaps the greatest not caused by the immediate threat of execution or starvation in history. Just by its sheer numbers, it's known as the Great Migration, a movement of more than 6 million blacks out of the rural southern United States to the urban Northeast and Midwest and West between 1910 and 1930. Now, during this particular period of time, the black population increased by about 40% in northern states, just as a result of migration, mostly in the major cities such as Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Baltimore, and New York had some of the largest increases in the early parts of the 20th century. Now, this migration drained off much of the rural black population of the South and for a time froze or reduced black population growths in many parts of the region. In fact, in a number of southern states, there were decades of black population decline, especially across the Deep South. The growing black presence outside the South, however, changed the dynamic and demographics of a number of cities in the North, Midwest, and the West. When you consider that in 1900, only 7,400 blacks lived outside the South, that's just 8% of the nation's total black population. But by 1970, more than 10.6 million blacks lived outside the South. That's 47% of the nation's total. Now, because black migrants concentrated in these big cities of the North and West, their influence was magnified in those places. Cities that had been virtually all white at the start of the century became centers of black culture and politics by the 1950s. Segregation and the tendency of any people to settle with others like themselves led to concentrations of blacks in certain areas. Later, in what could be called the Second Great Migration, another wave of black migration took place as mechanization of agriculture started to eliminate rural jobs in the South and created a labor surplus by the 1930s and 40s. That is to say, it was very difficult to find a job. This is also the Depression era just before World War II. Then the industrial buildup during World War II acted as another pull factor in the second phase of the Second Great Migration, starting in 1940 and lasting until about 1970. Altogether, in the first half of the 20th century, 6.5 million blacks migrated from the South to leave and to do as previous generations had done. Leave the rural and urban areas of the South and leave lynching and segregation behind. But unlike the first round, composed chiefly of rural farm workers, included more educated workers and their families who were already living in southern cities and towns. In this migration, you have blacks not only moving out of the rural southern cities and towns, but they're also moving out of southern cities as well, moving on to places like Louisiana and from Mississippi to Texas to California and other Midwest cities as defense industries recruited thousands to higher paying and more skilled jobs. They started going out west, settled in cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Oakland. And that brings us to what could only be called a new Great Migration. That's a demographic change that started about 1965 to present, which is a reversal of the previous 35-year trend of blacks migrating within the United States. See, somewhere around 1965, the deindustrialization of some cities in the Northwest and the Midwest found a growth of new jobs actually in this so-called New South, with lower cost of living, family and kinship ties, and improving racial relations. Started to be a reverse attraction for blacks back to the Old South. And substantial number of blacks have, were, and are making a return back to the South. When I was a kid growing up in Richmond, Virginia during the 1960s and 70s, in an area called Church Hill, it was old and dilapidated, the oldest part of the city in Richmond, in fact. There were a lot of black people in the community who had recently for their families, that is to say within 5 or 10 years at that time, had just moved from the country or rural parts of mostly South Carolina and some parts of rural Virginia, were all over the place. They had accents, habits, like keeping animals, had angry dogs that they beat and fed gunpowder. They kept piles of wood in the backyard, front yard, and on the porch. They seemed to have lots of kids. They fought a lot. They fought each other. They fought everybody else. In fact, our family next door would eat ashes, put poultice around their neck when they got sick, call on the root lady when things didn't work, gurgle with urine, cut meat outdoors on a wooden block, and they also ate tangy meat. And what is tangy meat? Tangy meat is meat that had been spoiled and was put in a pot and boiled and reboiled. I remember they seemed to beat their kids a lot more viciously. And they used the word whipping and beating, not discipline. I can remember kids that I went to school with and played with that got whipped with electric cords, and switches were still in fashion. Many of the kids seemed to be much older than they should have been for the grades we were in, because a lot of them coming out of the country, their folks didn't get them started to school until they were 7, 8, 9 years old sometimes. I remember hearing their parents, along with mine, rave about the good old days, and they all seemed to have an intense fear of white people, like my folks, laborers, maids, servants, and workers. They were glad to be living in the city, a city that pales in comparison to most large urban areas of the North. When they were religious, they went to holiness churches primarily. Now, my family itself was just one generation out of the woods itself, and we stuck to the familiar habits that my folks had brought with them. We put potatoes in jars and watched them grow. Is really countrified way of having house plants. We put slivers of soap in a single jar to make one big giant blob of soap, and all the used grease in a can on the stove. We ate wild food when we could get it. You could go down to the farmer's market downtown in Richmond and get possum, raccoon, and muskrat skinned and on ice. People used to say, if you cut off the head and the front paws, you really can't tell the difference between a cat and a rabbit when it's on ice. I don't even know if you could buy wild meat like that today, if that would even be legal. In the wintertime, we were always awakened by the sound of the woodman about 5 o'clock in the morning as he drove down the street, screaming out, "Wood, woodman, wood, woodman." And my mama would wake me up and have me run out and stop the truck and ask, "Did you get an armful of kindling to get that fire started in the front room?" Well, this one is done. But before I end, I wanted to mention some wonderful, wonderful people who became patrons of the podcast. Isn't that amazing? We do have Patreon now, and these people I want to thank David Joe Miller. Man, you are wonderful. Thank you, David Joe. Thank you. I want to thank Charles Stein. Thank you, Charles. I really needed your help. You've been a good supporter of the podcast, brother. Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Karen Freeman. Oh, girl, thank you. I really appreciate your support. I really appreciate you sticking with the podcast. That means a lot to me. And I want to thank Carmine and Vara Cooper. Love you, Carmine. Love you, Vara. You guys are special to me. Thank you. The podcast appreciate you from the bottom of my heart. All of you guys, I really, really appreciate you. Once again, David Joe, Charles Stein, Karen Freeman, Carmine Sweetwater Cooper. Thank you, you guys. Podcast needs you. This podcast is produced by me with special assistance from Dr. T. I am the researcher, the host, the editor, producer, and the janitor for the podcast. This is a love podcast. I do it because I love you. I don't do it to make money. This podcast doesn't really make money. It loses money, but this is love. I do it out of the bottom of my heart. I love you. I care about you. Let me hear from you. I need to hear from you. I want to hear from you. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. Tell your enemies. Until next time.
You have just finished another episode of What's Ray Saying, the podcast, hosted by Ray Christian. More episodes can be found at whatsraysaying.com or all the regular places podcasts can be found. For updates, comments, sneak peeks, follow What's Ray Saying on Facebook and Twitter. Ray builds this podcast with mountain spring water, deep-fried fatback, sunshine, and crackling bread. In turn, he enjoys the love, appreciation, comments, and fan mail. But oddly enough, we couldn't pay the electric bill with any of those. This is a homegrown, grassroots, listener-supported podcast. If you would like to translate your enjoyment and support into dollars so Ray can keep making new episodes, go to whatsraysaying.com and click on the Donate to the Podcast page. There you will find links to give a one-time donation via PayPal or become a regular supporter through Patreon. If you're too lazy to do all that clicking, then PayPal the podcast at paypal.me/whatsraysaying or set up monthly contributions at patreon.com/whatsraysaying. Tell a friend or 2 or 20 or 200, post it on your Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or the bathroom wall at the gas station. Tell everybody you know that you've been listening to What's Ray Saying, the podcast.